At 7 a.m. on January 24, 1945, First Lieutenant Garland Merle Connor stood in the frozen command post of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, watching German artillery shells tear apart the tree-line 400 yards ahead. He was 25 years old, an intelligence officer, recently returned from the hospital with wounds still healing. The German 19th Army had assembled 600 infantry and 6 Mark VI Tiger tanks for a counterattack aimed at breaking through American positions near Husson, France. Connor was 5 feet 6 inches and 120 pounds, a tobacco farmer from Clinton County, Kentucky, who had never finished high school because the nearest school was 15 miles from his family's farm. He enlisted in March 1941 and, over 4 years of war, had fought in 10 major campaigns, participated in 4 amphibious assaults, and been wounded 7 times. His last injury had sent him to the hospital 3 weeks earlier, and he had returned to his battalion 2 days before. The 3rd Battalion held a section of the front north of the Khmar Pocket, the last German-held territory in France, covering 850 square miles of frozen forest and farmland west of the Rhine River. The Germans had maintained control since November, and every attempt to eliminate the pocket had failed. The French First Army had lost thousands attempting to push them back across the Rhine. Operation Nordwind, the last major German offensive in the west, had begun on New Year's Day. Hitler had ordered Army Group G to break American lines in Alsace. While the Battle of the Bulge continued 300 miles north, the offensive had failed, yet the Germans in the Khmar Pocket remained, desperate to hold their ground. 3rd Battalion had been on the front line for 18 days in temperatures averaging 10 degrees below zero. Snow covered everything, and soldiers slept in frozen foxholes whenever they could. German patrols tested American positions nightly. The battalion had lost 43 men in 2 weeks, mostly to artillery and sniper fire. Connor worked in the battalion command post as an intelligence officer, gathering information on enemy movements, interrogating prisoners, analyzing patrol reports, and marking German positions on maps. It was not a combat role. Intelligence officers stayed behind the lines, relying on reports and maps and rarely leading attacks. But Connor had never stayed behind the lines. He had earned 4 Silver Stars for direct combat actions, in Italy in October 1943, at Anzio in January 1944, in France in September 1944, and again in February 1945. Each award recognized acts where he risked his life to save others. He had a reputation in the battalion for moving forward when the situation became desperate. At 7:15, the German artillery barrage intensified, shells sweeping across the forward positions, tearing apart trees and throwing frozen earth into the air. The 12-minute barrage ended suddenly, leaving silence before the rumble of tank engines. A runner burst into the command post, reporting the German advance, 6 Tigers followed by hundreds of infantry moving through the woods toward the battalion's left flank. The battalion commander studied the map. If the Tigers reached American positions, they would overrun the foxholes. No American tanks or tank destroyers were in place to stop them. Artillery was the only option, but it required a forward observer to see and adjust fire. The observation post had been destroyed, its personnel dead or wounded, and from the command post, the view was blocked by trees. Connor studied the map. The German advance was coming through a wooded section 400 yards from the command post. Observing it meant someone would have to cross open ground under enemy fire, then hold position ahead of the American line as 6 Tiger tanks and 600 infantry approached. Connor picked up a telephone and 400 yards of wire, glanced at the battalion commander, and walked out into the snow. The artillery barrage had stopped, but he knew it would resume. German guns typically fired preparation barrages before tank attacks, holding their fire until infantry drew closer, then opening up to pin down defenders while the Tigers moved forward. Connor ran across the 400 yards of frozen, snow-covered ground, the telephone wire unspooling behind him, the spool in his left hand and the handset in his right. His boots broke through the snow with each step. At 100 yards, German guns opened fire. Shells landed 40 yards to his left and 30 yards to his right. The Germans were adjusting. Observers watching the open ground could see a lone American soldier running toward their attack. A shell hit a tree 70 yards ahead, and it exploded, sending splinters and branches raining down. Connor kept moving. Another shell landed 20 yards behind him, the blast wave hitting him like a fist. He stumbled but did not fall. The wire behind him continued to unspool. At 250 yards, a shell struck a tree directly in his path. The trunk split, and half of it fell across the snow. Connor vaulted over it without stopping. Shrapnel tore through the branches, hot metal pieces hissing in the snow. Another shell landed 15 yards to his left, throwing frozen dirt into the air and slamming his eardrums. His own breathing was drowned out by high-pitched ringing. He reached the American front line at 300 yards. Soldiers crouched in foxholes stared at him. An intelligence officer running toward the German advance with a telephone. He did not pause to explain and kept moving toward the enemy. 30 yards beyond the foxholes, Connor found what he needed. A shallow ditch, maybe 18 inches deep, enough to lower his silhouette below the snow while giving a clear view of the German advance. He dropped into the ditch. The telephone wire held. He cranked the handset. A buzz, then a voice from the Artillery Fire Direction Center 3 miles behind the front line. American 105 mm howitzers, 12 guns, enough to stop a German attack if fired accurately. Connor gave his position and the officer confirmed. He was now the eyes of 3rd Battalion's artillery. Everything depended on what he could see and whether he could survive long enough to direct the fire. He raised his head above the ditch. The German infantry were 200 yards away, moving through the trees in squad formations, rifles ready, advancing in short rushes with covering fire. Experienced soldiers, trained to attack defended positions. Behind them, the Tigers. Connor saw 4 massive 60-ton tanks moving through the forest like they were saplings. The Tigers stayed in the treeline for cover but would enter open ground in minutes. The German infantry had not noticed him. He was alone 30 yards ahead of the American line in a shallow ditch with a telephone, 600 German soldiers approaching. Connor lifted the handset and gave coordinates. Fire mission. Enemy infantry in the open, 600 meters, adjusting. The first shells would arrive in 40 seconds. If the Germans spotted him before they landed, he would be killed. If they landed too close, the result would be the same. If too far, the attack would continue, and 600 Germans would overrun the battalion. Connor watched, counting seconds. 38, 39, 40. The sky screamed as 12 105 mm shells hit the treeline 150 yards behind the German infantry. Too far. Connor adjusted, drop 100, fire for effect. The Germans continued advancing, the initial shells ignored, assuming the defenders were guessing. Connor was not guessing. He could see every soldier and every squad leader directing men forward. The second salvo arrived 18 seconds later, landing in the middle of the formation. The forest exploded, trees disintegrating, shrapnel flying in all directions. Each shell carried 14 pounds of high explosive, 12 guns delivering 168 pounds of explosive at once among 600 men. Soldiers went down, others disappeared, the advance halted. Connor cranked the handset. Repeat fire. Another salvo. Then another. The American guns fired for effect at maximum rate, 4 rounds per minute per gun, 48 shells every 60 seconds hammering the same 200 square yards of forest. German squads broke apart, scattering in all directions. Soldiers ran for cover. Some dove behind trees while others tried to crawl away from the impact zone. The forest had become a deadly area. The Tigers were still advancing. Connor could now see all 6. They had broken out of the treeline and moved into open ground. The artillery had not affected them. 105 mm shells could damage a Tiger's tracks or optics but could not penetrate the armor. Multiple direct hits were needed, and even then the shells might bounce off. The tanks advanced in a wedge formation, 2 in front, 2 behind, and 2 more at the rear. Tank commanders stood in the turrets scanning for targets, searching for American positions. One Tiger fired. The 88mm gun cracked like thunder. The shell hit a foxhole 300 yards to Connor's right, sending dirt and snow into the air. The soldiers inside were killed. Another Tiger fired, another foxhole destroyed. The Tigers were 300 yards from the American line. In 4 minutes they would reach the foxholes. If they crossed the line, the 3rd Battalion would collapse. Tigers in the rear would cause panic and retreat. Hundreds of soldiers would run while the Germans pursued, killing the retreating troops. They would push deeper into the 6th Army Group sector, and the entire front could collapse. Connor adjusted his fire mission. Enemy armor advancing, 250 meters, adjust fire onto the tanks. Artillery was not designed for tanks. It saturated areas, killed infantry, destroyed buildings, and cut communications. Tanks were small, fast, armored targets. The first shells fell around the Tigers, one landing 10 yards in front of the lead tank, another behind the formation. The Tigers pressed forward, their commanders confident that 105s could not stop them. Connor needed closer hits. Drop 50, fire for effect. The next salvo landed among the Tigers. A shell struck the lead tank's right track. The track broke and the Tiger turned hard and stopped. Immobilized but still dangerous, its turret and 88mm gun operational. Another shell hit the engine deck of a second Tiger, smoke pouring from the rear. The crew might abandon it or continue fighting. 4 Tigers were still advancing, adjusting their course toward Connor. Tank commanders had spotted his muzzle flashes and the telephone wire. They knew someone was directing the artillery and were coming to eliminate him. Connor checked the ditch. 18 inches of cover, not enough to stop an 88mm shell, machine gun fire, or anything a Tiger could fire. The Germans were 150 yards away. Close enough to see the crew markings and faces of the tank commanders. He lifted the handset one final time. Fire on my position. The fire direction officer repeated the coordinates. Connor confirmed. The officer asked again. Calling artillery on your own position was not standard procedure. It meant shells would land within yards of the observer, and the observer could die. Connor confirmed a 3rd time. 40 seconds later, shells landed 30 yards in front of his ditch. The concussion hit like a truck. Air pressure shifted, his lungs compressed, vision blurred. Frozen dirt and shrapnel rained overhead. The sound was beyond thunder. He stayed in the ditch, keeping the handset pressed to his ear. Drop 20, repeat fire. The next salvo landed 20 yards out, close enough that Connor could feel the heat from the explosions and shrapnel tore through the air 6 feet above his head. If he stood up he would be shredded. Any closer and the ditch would not protect him. The Tigers had stopped advancing. The tank commanders had closed their hatches. The artillery was landing too near, even a Tiger crew preferred to remain inside their armor. But the German infantry was regrouping. Connor could see them forming up again, about 200 soldiers who had survived the initial barrage. They were using the Tigers for cover, moving when the tanks moved, treating the armor as mobile fortresses. The attack was continuing. Connor adjusted fire. He walked the shells back and forth across the German advance. Whenever infantry tried to move forward he dropped shells on them. Whenever a Tiger advanced he called fire just in front of it. One Tiger took a direct hit on the turret. The shell did not penetrate, but the impact damaged the turret ring and it could no longer rotate, making the tank effectively useless. Another Tiger lost its second track and could no longer move. The crew abandoned it. 5 men scrambled from the hatches toward the German lines. American machine gun fire from the foxholes cut 2 down, while the other 3 disappeared into the trees. 3 Tigers remained operational and the German infantry was getting closer. Connor could now see individual faces 100 yards away. Soldiers crawled through the snow using shell craters for cover, moving in small groups to try to flank his position. If they reached him they could cut the telephone wire and stop the artillery. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero. Connor had been lying in the ditch for 40 minutes. His hands and feet were numb. Each shell landing nearby sent frozen dirt into his eyes and mouth. The handset was slippery with ice, but he continued to call fire. A shell landed 15 yards to his right, then another 15 yards to his left. The Germans had bracketed him. Their artillery observers had pinpointed his position and were trying to kill him with counter-battery fire. German and American shells were landing within the same 100-yard radius. The ditch had become the focal point of 2 artillery barrages. Soldiers in 3rd Battalion's foxholes watched a lone lieutenant lying ahead of the line, calling artillery on his own position. German shells tried to kill him. American shells landed so close fragments hit the edge of his ditch. Yet he did not move. He stayed in place, adjusting fire, killing Germans. The German infantry advanced again, now 80 yards away. Close enough that Connor could hear officers shouting commands and the bolt actions of their Mauser rifles. He adjusted the artillery another 10 yards. The shells landed between him and the Germans, 60 yards from his position. Blast waves hammered him. Dirt cascaded into the ditch. Something hit his left shoulder, shrapnel or a rock. His shoulder went numb. He switched the handset to his right hand. The German advance stopped but did not retreat. They found cover, knowing the observer had to be nearby and that if they could locate him they could end the attack. The 3 remaining Tigers began moving again, spreading 50 yards apart to make themselves harder targets. They were 200 yards from the American foxholes. Connor called fire on the leftmost Tiger, then the center, then the right, dividing the artillery between the targets to damage tracks and optics and slow them. 1 shell hit the center Tiger's front glacis plate. The armor held, but the impact rocked the 60-ton tank backward. The driver lost control momentarily, and the Tiger swerved left. 1 Tiger's track caught on a frozen stump and jammed. 2 Tigers still advanced and the German infantry was inside 50 yards. The German officer leading the attack was 30 yards from Connor's ditch. Connor could see his face. Young, about 22, probably a lieutenant. The officer signaled his men forward with hand gestures. No shouting now, sound would reveal their exact positions. 20 soldiers followed, crawling through the snow with rifles ready. They moved in a skirmish line, trying to attack Connor from multiple angles. Connor cranked the handset and gave new coordinates. Drop 5, fire for effect. The shells landed 25 yards in front of him. The officer disappeared in the explosion along with 4 soldiers. The others pressed themselves into the snow, waiting for the barrage to pass. But Connor kept the shells falling, adjusting left and right, creating a wall of explosions between him and the German infantry. The shells were landing so close he could feel the heat on his face. Hot fragments struck the edge of the ditch, some landing inside. 1 piece of shrapnel embedded itself in the frozen ground 2 inches from his right hand. The 2 remaining Tigers had closed to 150 yards from the American foxholes, close enough to use their machine guns. The bow gunners opened fire with sustained bursts from their MG-34S, 792 rounds per minute. Bullets tore through the tree-line, chewed through logs, and kicked up snow and dirt. Soldiers in the foxholes returned fire but rifle bullets could not harm a Tiger. American machine gunners tried to hit vision ports, hoping to blind the drivers and force the tanks to button up, slowing their advance. It was not working. The Tigers kept moving. Connor shifted fire back to the tanks. He called for smoke shells mixed with high explosive. The smoke would obscure the Tiger's vision, making it harder to spot targets, while high explosives would continue to damage tracks and optics. The artillery battery complied. Smoke and high explosive shells landed around the Tigers. Thick white smoke billowed up, choking the air. The Tigers disappeared into the smoke but kept advancing. Connor could hear engines and tracks grinding through frozen earth. A Tiger emerged 70 yards from the foxholes. The 88mm gun fired, hitting an American machine gun position, killing 3 soldiers. Connor called fire directly on the Tiger, danger close, specifying exact coordinates. The fire direction officer hesitated because the shells would land within 50 yards of Connor. The shrapnel radius of a 105 shell was 50 yards, putting him in the kill zone. Connor confirmed the coordinates. The shells landed. One hit 10 yards behind the Tiger, another 15 yards to the left, and a third directly in front. The explosion tore into the front hull. The driver's vision port shattered and the tank swerved hard right, crashing into a crater and stopping. The crew tried to back out, but the tracks spun. One Tiger remained. The German infantry regrouped and advanced again, this time from a different angle using the smoke for cover. Connor could not see them, only hear them. Voices in the smoke, boots crunching in the snow, metallic clicks of rifle bolts. He estimated their position and called fire. Shells landed in the smoke. He adjusted based on sound, shifting left or right depending on where he heard movement. The artillery battery was running low on ammunition. The fire direction officer reported about 15 minutes of sustained fire remained. After that, they would need to pause to reload. 15 minutes without artillery support could allow the Germans to overwhelm the American positions. Connor had been in the ditch for 1 hour and 20 minutes. His assistant had joined him 40 minutes earlier, a private from the battalion intelligence section. The private had crawled from the foxholes with extra telephone wire and a backup handset. He lay 5 feet to Connor's right, watching for German infantry and calling out positions. The private spotted movement 15 yards away, German soldiers moving through the smoke. Connor gave the coordinates. The shells landed 12 yards out. The concussion lifted both men off the bottom of the ditch. Dirt, ice, and shrapnel filled the air. Something struck the private. He screamed. Shrapnel had torn through his left leg and blood poured into the snow. Connor grabbed him and pulled him deeper into the ditch. The private was still conscious but needed a medic. He refused evacuation, staying in the ditch to keep watching for Germans. Despite his leg bleeding, he continued calling out positions. The last Tiger was 60 yards from the American line, and German soldiers were within 10 yards of Connor. He dropped artillery 5 yards in front of the ditch. The shells landed closer than any previous fire mission. The blast lifted him off the ground and slammed him back into the frozen earth. His ears went deaf. Silence, then a high-pitched ringing drowned every other sound. The German soldiers who had been 10 yards away were gone. Connor cranked the handset, hands shaking from cold, shock, or exhaustion. The fire direction officer's voice came faintly, distant like from another world. Connor adjusted fire onto the last Tiger. The tank was 40 yards from the foxholes, close enough that its machine guns could suppress every defensive position and its main gun could destroy foxholes at point-blank range. The Tiger's turret traversed, searching for targets. The commander had his hatch open, standing in the turret, choosing which position to destroy first. Connor gave coordinates and requested high explosive, maximum concentration. Every gun the battery could bring to bear fired simultaneously. 12 shells struck at once. The Tiger disappeared in a storm of explosions. When the smoke cleared, the tank was still intact but immobile. The armor held, but the driver's vision blocks were shattered. The tank commander had dropped into the turret and closed the hatch. The crew abandoned the vehicle. 5 men scrambled out toward the treeline. American rifles fired from the foxholes. 3 tankers were killed, 2 reached cover. All 6 Tigers were destroyed or abandoned. The German armor assault had failed, but the infantry continued fighting. Companies of soldiers were scattered across 300 yards of forest and field. They had suffered massive casualties, at least 150 dead, maybe 200. 400 remained, seasoned veterans. They knew how to fight without tank support, how to use terrain, find cover, and advance even under artillery fire. Connor shifted the artillery back to the German infantry positions. He walked shells across the tree line where the soldiers had taken cover, across the shell craters where small groups were hiding, and across the approaches where reinforcements might advance. The fire direction officer reported 10 minutes of ammunition remaining. The battalion commander came on the radio and ordered Connor to withdraw, fall back to the American line while artillery provided covering fire. Connor remained in the ditch. From his position he could see the entire German formation, every attempt to rally, every movement, every effort to regroup for another assault. If he withdrew, the Americans would lose their forward observer, artillery would fire blind, and the Germans could mass for a final push. Without accurate fire, that push might succeed. The wounded private was still beside him, conscious. His leg had stopped bleeding, frozen by the cold. The private kept his rifle ready, watching the approaches. If German soldiers rushed the ditch, he would fight. 2 hours had passed since Connor had left the command post. German artillery began falling again. Their observers had finally pinpointed Connor's position. Shells landed 20 yards behind the ditch, then 15, then 10. The Germans were walking their fire toward him in a methodical, professional way. In another minute, the shells would strike the ditch. Connor called counter-battery fire and gave coordinates for the German artillery positions. American guns shifted, firing on German howitzers 3 miles behind the front line. The German fire slackened, then stopped. Counter-battery fire was effective. German gun crews took cover or were destroyed. Connor shifted fire back to the infantry. The sun had risen. Full daylight now. The Germans could see how many had died, the destroyed Tigers, the cratered forest, and 1 American lieutenant lying in a shallow ditch with a telephone, calling down artillery. A German squad tried once more. 8 soldiers ran from the left, trying to close the distance before Connor could adjust fire. They reached 40 yards when the shells landed. The explosions threw their bodies into the air. No more Germans advanced. The fire direction officer reported 5 minutes of ammunition remaining. Then the guns would go silent, but the German attack had stalled. Surviving soldiers pulled back, dragging wounded comrades and leaving their dead behind. Connor kept the shells falling, pursuing the retreating Germans, preventing them from reforming, ensuring they understood that any attack on 3rd Battalion would mean death. 3 hours after Connor had picked up the telephone and left the command post, the German counterattack ended. Connor stayed in the ditch another 20 minutes, watching to make sure no follow-up attack came. The handset was silent. The artillery battery had ceased fire, guns needing to reload and cool. The battlefield was quiet. No engines, no rifles, no explosions, just whine through shattered trees and faint distant German voices 300 yards away. Connor finally stood. His legs barely held him after 2 hours lying in frozen earth. His muscles had locked, his joints stiff. He took 1 step, then another. The wounded private could not stand. Connor helped him, supporting his weight. They began walking back to the American line. Soldiers emerged from the foxholes, staring at Connor, at the ditch where he had lain, at the cratered ground between them and the German positions. The earth looked like the surface of the moon. Shell craters overlapped, equipment was destroyed, pieces of Tigers scattered across 200 yards, bodies on the ground. The battalion commander met Connor at the foxhole line, looked over the battlefield and at Connor, and nodded without speaking. Medics took the wounded private to the aid station. The private survived. The leg wound was clean with no broken bones, and he would return to the battalion in 6 weeks. Connor walked to the command post. His shoulder was still numb. Something had hit him during the 3rd or 4th hour. A medic examined it, removed a small piece of embedded shrapnel, bandaged the wound, and told Connor he was lucky. After the German retreat, the intelligence section went forward, counting bodies and destroyed equipment and making notes for the after-action report. 53 German soldiers were confirmed dead, 78 wounded left behind. Actual casualties were higher since the Germans had dragged many of their dead and wounded back to their lines. Total German losses were estimated at over 150 killed and wounded. All 6 Tiger tanks were destroyed or abandoned. 4 were immobilized by artillery damage, and 2 were abandoned after catastrophic track failures. American recovery teams would later salvage the Tigers, study the armor, examine fire control systems, and gather intelligence. 3rd Battalion had lost 11 soldiers killed and 23 wounded. Most casualties occurred before Connor reached the ditch. During the initial German artillery barrage, 3 more Americans were killed by the Tigers before their destruction. Once Connor began directing artillery, American casualties stopped. The battalion remained on the line for another 8 days. The Germans did not attack again. They had lost too many men and tanks. The Khmar pocket offensive ended. The 19th Army would spend the next 2 weeks holding their positions while the French First Army prepared for the final push. On February 10, 1945, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch presented Connor with the Distinguished Service Cross. Patch, commander of the 7th Army, had come to 3rd Battalion specifically to present the award. The citation recognized Connor's extraordinary heroism during the German counterattack on January 24, detailing his advance under fire, 3 hours directing artillery from an exposed position, and his decision to call fire on his own position when the Germans closed within yards. The battalion commander had recommended Connor for the Medal of Honor, but the award process was too slow. Connor was being rotated back to the United States after 28 consecutive months of combat and 7 wounds. On March 15, Connor left France, sailing from Le Havre to New York, arriving 3 weeks later. He was honorably discharged on June 22, 1945. The war in Europe ended May 8, by which time Connor was already home, trying to forget. Albany, Kentucky held a parade in his honor in May. Alvin York, the most famous Medal of Honor recipient from World War I, spoke at the ceremony. York understood what Connor had done and the weight of it. At the parade, Connor met Pauline Wells, 20 years old, who had heard the stories about his service and medal citations. She could not believe the quiet 5'6" farmer standing in front of her had accomplished what the officers described. Connor rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he said he had left those memories across the Atlantic. He married Pauline on July 9, 1945. They lived on a farm on Indian Creek, several miles north of Albany, without electricity or running water. They worked the land with mules and horses, growing tobacco and corn, continuing the family tradition. In 1950, the government purchased their property for the creation of Lake Cumberland. They relocated to the Roland community in southeastern Clinton County and started again with new land and crops. Connor became president of the Clinton County Farm Bureau, holding the position for 17 years, advising farmers on crop rotation, soil conservation, and navigating agricultural bureaucracy. He was active in veterans organizations, including Paralyzed Veterans of America and Disabled American Veterans, helping veterans file claims for benefits. Connor never spoke about January 24, 1945. Pauline asked him once what had happened in France and what he had done to earn all those medals. He replied simply that he had done what needed to be done and would not elaborate. His medals remained in a cardboard box in a duffel bag in the back of the living room closet. The Distinguished Service Cross, 4 silver stars, a bronze star, Purple Hearts, and the French Croix de Guerre were all there, but he never displayed them. 53 years later, in 1996, a veteran named Richard Chilton wrote to Connor. Chilton was researching his uncle, Private Gordon Roberts, killed at Anzio in January 1944, who had served with Connor. Connor invited Chilton to visit. At 77, diabetic and with kidney failure, Connor recounted Anzio and Roberts. He described carrying Roberts to a medical aid station and staying with him until he died. As he spoke, Connor cried. The memory remained raw even 52 years later. Pauline suggested Chilton look through Connor's military records and brought out the duffel bag and cardboard box. Chilton opened the box, saw the medals, and read the citations. His hands began to shake. He looked at Connor and Pauline and said simply, "This man should have been awarded the Medal of Honor." Chilton began the process, submitting paperwork to the Army Board for Correction of Military Records, gathering eyewitness statements from men who had served with Connor, and building a case to upgrade the Distinguished Service Cross. The board rejected the application in 1997 and again denied an appeal in 2000. Connor died on November 5, 1998, at 79 years old. He was buried in Memorial Hill Cemetery in Albany with the Distinguished Service Cross. Pauline did not give up. She collected additional eyewitness accounts, including testimony from 3 soldiers who had been in the foxholes on January 24 and had observed Connor in the ditch for 3 hours. She resubmitted the case in 2008. Historians, authors, and lawmakers supported the upgrade. Stephen Ambrose wrote about Connor in 2000, calling his actions far above the call of duty. The Rhode Island Senate passed a resolution in 2005 recommending the Medal of Honor, and 7 retired generals endorsed the application. Still, nothing happened. In 2014, Pauline sued the Army in federal court. A judge ruled she had waited too long. She appealed to the Sixth Circuit Court. The case went to mediation, and during the proceedings, the government attorney became emotional, noting that her father had served in 3rd Battalion and been wounded the day after Connor's action. She said Connor might have saved her father's life. The Army Board finally recommended the upgrade in 2015. Congress passed legislation waiving the time limit. On March 29, 2018, the White House announced the award. On June 26, President Trump presented the Medal of Honor to Pauline in the East Room. She was 89 years old. It had been 22 years since Chilton first opened the box and 20 years since Connor had died. The citation was read aloud. First Lieutenant Garland Merle Connor distinguished himself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity. He volunteered to run 400 yards through enemy fire, directed artillery for 3 hours from an exposed position, called fire on his own location, killed 50 German soldiers, stopped 6 Tiger tanks, and saved his battalion. Pauline held the medal her husband had never sought, never displayed, and had left in a box for 50 years because he believed speaking about it would be bragging. Connor, the second most decorated soldier of World War II after Audie Murphy, had remained almost unknown. If this story moved you as it moved us, show your support by hitting the like button. Every like helps YouTube share this story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications to help rescue forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. These are stories of soldiers who saved battalions with courage and determination. Drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from, whether it is the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Share your location and tell us if someone in your family served. Thank you for watching and for helping ensure Garland Merle Connor and men like him are remembered. Their heroism deserves to live on.